For years, American dominance in global trade had been unquestioned. But this time, Canada didn't just fight back. It outmaneuvered the United States at every turn. The US thought it could pressure Canada into submission. But instead, it triggered an economic firestorm that spiraled out of control. What started as a trade war quickly turned into a full-scale financial crisis. And now, Washington is scrambling to contain the fallout. From devastating tariffs to a nationwide travel boycott, Canada's counterattack hit where it hurt the most. And as US businesses, workers, and politicians began feeling the pressure, something unprecedented happened. Trump's own allies started turning against him. How did Canada pull this off? Why is this trade war shaking the foundations of American power? And could this be the moment that ends US economic supremacy? Stick with us to the end, because what happens next might just rewrite global history. The US thought Canada would fold. That was a massive miscalculation. What happens when a superpower picks a fight it cannot win? The United States thought it could steamroll Canada economically. Instead, it triggered a retaliation that would shake the White House to its core. For decades, the United States and Canada built one of the most intertwined trade relationships in the world. Goods, services, and raw materials flowed between the two nations effortlessly, supporting industries on both sides of the border. The supply chains were seamless, the economies deeply connected. But that balance was shattered when the United States government, under President Donald Trump, launched an aggressive economic strike. On the 1st of February in the year 2025, Washington imposed a sweeping set of tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. The official reasoning? Border security and drug trafficking. But behind closed doors, it was clear. This was never about security. It was about economic control. The United States wanted leverage, a way to pressure Canada into submission. The assumption in Washington was simple. Canada, heavily reliant on American markets, would have no choice but to absorb the impact. After all, this was not the first time the United States had played hardball. Canada had endured trade disputes before, often finding ways to compromise or negotiate. Washington expected history to repeat itself, but this time it had miscalculated, because Canada was not just going to retaliate, it was about to flip the script entirely. Canada's $155 billion counterattack, a move Washington never saw coming. If you thought Canada would respond with hesitation, think again. This was not just a pushback. It was an economic missile aimed at America's biggest industries. Within days of the United States tariffs taking effect, Canada unleashed a $155 billion counterstrike. Unlike the broad and sweeping restrictions imposed by Washington, Canada's response was precise, targeted, and devastating. The retaliation came in two phases. The first, worth $30 billion, went into effect immediately, while the remaining $125 billion would follow soon after. But here's where Canada's move was different. Instead of just imposing blanket tariffs across multiple industries, it went straight for the sectors that would hurt Trump politically. The strategy was surgical. Industries with the strongest lobbying power in Washington, agriculture, automobiles, and consumer goods, were hit the hardest. And while nearly every major export was included, oil and energy were notably spared. Was this a sign of weakness? Absolutely not. Canada knew that oil and energy were vital to both economies. By keeping those industries untouched, Canada ensured that it still had leverage while focusing its attack elsewhere. Almost immediately, signs of economic distress started surfacing in the United States. Auto manufacturers, who relied on Canadian parts, faced skyrocketing costs and severe supply chain disruptions. American farmers, already struggling with global price pressures, saw one of their biggest export markets suddenly close its doors. And as consumer goods became more expensive, retailers braced for a sharp decline in sales. The economic pain was setting in. And then, Canada launched its most devastating economic attack yet, one that would send shockwaves across America. Canada's secret weapon, the move that shocked the US economy. Tariffs were just the opening move. Canada had something even more powerful up its sleeve. Beyond taxing American goods, Canada urged its citizens to stop vacationing in the United States. At first, it sounded like a simple boycott, But it was not. This was a direct economic strike against one of America's most vulnerable sectors: tourism. Every year, millions of Canadians travel south, spending billions in states like Florida, California, and New York. For these regions, Canadian visitors are not just another group of tourists. They are a massive economic force, one that supports hotels, restaurants, entertainment venues, and entire industries. And now that spending was about to vanish. In a televised speech, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau delivered a message that sent shivers through the travel and hospitality sectors in the United States. Choose Canada, not the United States. With those words, he urged Canadians to rethink their travel plans and invest their money at home. It worked. Airlines and travel agencies immediately reported a spike in cancellations. Resorts and hotels in American tourist hotspots braced for impact. It was not just individuals canceling vacations. Businesses, conference organizers, and major Canadian corporations began redirecting trips elsewhere. Florida, which typically welcomed millions of Canadian visitors every year, faced a sudden downturn. California saw the same. Even cities like Las Vegas, where Canadian travelers made up a significant share of the gambling industry's revenue, began reporting declining attendance. And as tourism revenue dried up, panic started to set in among U.S. businesses. But it was not just the tourism sector feeling the heat. The first American casualties: factories shut down, farmers go bankrupt. When Washington launched the trade war, it expected to hurt Canada. But the first industries to fall, they were all American. The automobile sector was among the hardest hit. For decades, U.S. car manufacturers had relied on Canadian-made parts, seamlessly integrating production lines across the border. But as Canada's tariffs took effect, that system collapsed. Suddenly, supply chains that once flowed effortlessly were clogged with costs, delays, and logistical nightmares. Major auto factories in Michigan and Ohio faced immediate problems. The cost of producing vehicles spiked, forcing manufacturers to cut production and lay off workers. Dealerships braced for rising prices that would drive away customers. Meanwhile, American farmers were left with unsold crops rotting in storage. Canada had long been a critical market for U.S. agricultural exports. Grains, dairy, beef, and pork flowed north in massive quantities. But with tariffs now in place, those products were no longer competitive. Canadian buyers turned to domestic sources or sought imports from Europe and South America instead. For many American farmers, this was a financial death sentence. Margins were already razor thin. Without Canadian buyers, many had nowhere to sell their goods. Farms that had been in families for generations were suddenly at risk of foreclosure. And it was not just large industries feeling the impact. Small businesses across the United States, ones that depended on Canadian imports, began shutting their doors. Retailers saw supply shortages, while manufacturers faced rising costs for raw materials. The ripple effect was undeniable. The trade war had only just begun, but already its consequences were mounting. And yet, this was just the beginning of the American crisis. A political firestorm. Republican governors turn against Trump, Trump's biggest allies. They were now his biggest critics. When the tariffs against Canada were announced, Republican governors in key states initially stood by the administration, repeating the same promises that the trade restrictions would protect American jobs and industries. But as the consequences unfolded, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The first signs of rebellion came from the South. The governor of Florida, a longtime supporter of Trump's economic policies, publicly expressed concerns about the impact on the state's tourism industry. Canadian visitors had been a lifeline for Florida's hotels, restaurants, and theme parks for decades. With Canada's government urging its citizens to travel elsewhere, the effects were devastating. Resort towns that had once been bustling with vacationers now faced an economic winter. The numbers did not lie. In a matter of weeks, Florida's tourism industry had lost billions, and businesses were demanding action. The governor had no choice but to break ranks. In Michigan, the backlash was just as fierce, but for different reasons. Auto manufacturers, already struggling with supply chain disruptions, were now facing plummeting sales. Canadian consumers, once a significant market for American-made cars, had turned away from U.S. brands. Factories in Detroit and Grand Rapids were slowing production, cutting shifts, and laying off workers. The governor of Michigan, who had campaigned on bringing jobs back to the state, found himself in an impossible position. Either continue supporting Trump's tariffs or stand with the thousands of workers now at risk of losing their livelihoods. His decision was swift. He called for an immediate reevaluation of the trade war, stating that Michigan could not afford to be collateral damage in Washington's economic battles. Texas, a state that prided itself on economic strength and independence, was not immune. The tariffs on agricultural exports had crippled farmers, and the governor was under immense pressure from the industry. The Texas economy relied heavily on trade with Canada, and now that trade was slipping away. Grain, beef, and dairy farmers faced surplus products they could not sell, and food processing plants were reducing operations. The economic pain was real, and it was hitting one of Trump's strongest political bases. The governor of Texas made it clear that while he supported the administration, he could not ignore the devastation the tariffs were causing. He urged Washington to negotiate before more damage was done. The cracks were widening. In Congress, the divide was even more pronounced. Republican lawmakers who had previously backed the trade war were now openly debating whether it was worth the cost. Some pushed for urgent negotiations with Canada, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled further. Others, still aligned with Trump's strategy, insisted that the tariffs were necessary, and that any weakness shown now would embolden America's competitors. The Republican Party was at war with itself. But despite the mounting pressure, Trump refused to back down. His stance was unwavering. He insisted that the tariffs were a necessary tool to force Canada into a better deal, dismissing the concerns of governors and lawmakers as temporary setbacks. To him, this was not just an economic dispute. It was a battle for control. And Trump had no intention of losing. And that's when his frustration boiled over into a full-blown meltdown. Trump's furious meltdown. Inside the White House crisis, when faced with losing control, Trump did what he did best. He lashed out. Inside the White House, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Leaked reports from senior officials painted a picture of chaos behind closed doors. Trump was furious that his trade war was not going according to plan. What was supposed to be a show of American strength had turned into a crisis that was damaging his reputation. He took to social media with a flurry of posts attacking Canada's Prime Minister, accusing him of acting in bad faith and deliberately harming American industries. His words were not measured. They were not strategic. They were raw, unfiltered anger. He called Canada weak, dishonest, and claimed that without American trade, its economy would collapse. But the response from Canada was measured, calm, and unwavering. The message from the Prime Minister was clear. Canada would not be bullied. Trump's advisors were in full panic mode. The situation was deteriorating fast. With businesses, lawmakers, and governors turning against the tariffs, the White House was losing control of the narrative. Behind closed doors, economic advisors presented grim reports. The stock market was reacting negatively. Businesses were holding emergency meetings, and consumer prices were rising. The warnings were clear. If the trade war continued, the fallout would be severe. But Trump was not interested in hearing warnings. He wanted action. He demanded an escalation, insisting that even harsher tariffs be placed on Canadian goods. But this time, his administration pushed back. Senior officials, including members of his economic team, advised against it. They warned that the retaliation from Canada would only deepen the crisis. Trump did not want to hear it. He blamed his advisors for failing to control the situation. He blamed Republican lawmakers for being weak. He blamed the media for exaggerating the crisis. He blamed everyone except himself. And then something happened that nobody saw coming. Trump's biggest backers in business turned against him. The business revolt, U.S. CEOs warn of economic collapse. Big business had supported Trump's policies until they saw the damage firsthand. The first major shock came from the auto industry. The chief executives of the largest American car manufacturers publicly warned that the trade war was threatening the stability of the entire sector. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler were already feeling the effects of declining exports to Canada. Factories were scaling back, suppliers were struggling, and dealerships were reporting declining sales. But it was not just automakers. Major retailers like Walmart and Costco also sounded the alarm. The cost of goods was rising, and supply chain disruptions were making it difficult to keep prices stable. Consumers were feeling the squeeze. Everyday products that had once moved freely across the border were now subject to higher costs. Walmart executives warned that if the situation did not improve, American shoppers would see even steeper price hikes in the coming months. The financial sector reacted swiftly. Wall Street analysts predicted that if the trade war continued, the economic downturn would be unavoidable. The stock market wobbled as investors pulled back, fearing the long-term consequences of prolonged instability. The business community, which had once championed Trump's economic policies, was now demanding that the administration reconsider its stance. Trump was forced into closed-door meetings with business leaders. They presented him with cold, hard numbers, projections of what would happen if the trade war dragged on. The warnings were dire. Job losses would escalate, economic growth would slow, and American competitiveness on the global stage would take a major hit. But Trump was not one to admit defeat. He listened, but his stance remained the same. And that's when Trump was hit with a brutal reality check. Canada had already moved on. Canada finds new trade partners. The U.S. loses its grip. What if Canada did not even need the United States anymore? That was the question American businesses were now asking. While the White House was focused on escalating the trade war, Canada had been quietly securing new trade deals, reducing its reliance on the U.S. economy. European markets were quick to respond. With tariffs making American goods more expensive, Canadian companies turned to partners in the European Union. Agreements with Germany, France, and the Netherlands opened doors for industries that had once relied heavily on American exports. China took notice as well. While tensions between Washington and Beijing had made trade difficult, Canada found new opportunities. Deals with Chinese manufacturers and technology firms created fresh avenues for economic growth. Even South Korea joined the shift. Canadian energy, agricultural products, and consumer goods found new buyers, diversifying the economy and strengthening Canada's position on the global stage. American businesses suddenly realized they had lost something they had taken for granted: market access. The deep trade relationship that had fueled both economies for decades was no longer a guarantee. Canada had adapted. The United States had not. And just like that, America's biggest trade partner had outgrown it. The U.S. economy crumbles, a nation on edge. The American economy was not just struggling, it was starting to crack. What began as a strategic move to pressure Canada into economic submission had spiraled into an uncontrollable financial disaster. And for the first time, the White House was running out of options. Across the country, the effects were impossible to ignore. Grocery store aisles looked different. Price tags on basic essentials had climbed higher than anyone had ever expected. Families who once filled their carts without hesitation were now second-guessing every item. The cost of milk, meat, and fresh produce had soared, and the middle class was beginning to feel suffocated under the weight of rising expenses. Electronics, home appliances, and automobiles, products that had once flowed easily across the border, were now shockingly expensive. Retailers struggled to keep inventory moving as frustrated customers walked away from purchases they could no longer justify. The same businesses that had backed the administration's policies were now drowning in unforeseen costs, desperately searching for a way out. Then came the layoffs. At first, they were gradual, a few factories cutting shifts, a handful of companies freezing new hires. But as the trade war dragged on, the job market collapsed. Manufacturing hubs that once thrived on cross-border supply chains saw their operations grind to a halt. Farmers, already struggling to sell their products, watched as their incomes disappeared altogether. With over 400,000 jobs lost and no signs of relief, anger spread like wildfire. Protests erupted in major cities, fueled by frustration and desperation. Thousands gathered outside government buildings, demanding action. Business owners who had once championed economic nationalism were now calling for an end to the crisis. The stock market wavered as investors pulled back, fearing that the situation was far worse than Washington was admitting. But behind the scenes, the reality was even more chaotic. The administration, once confident in its strategy, was scrambling to contain the damage. As reports of economic distress filled the airwaves, political analysts began asking the question no one had dared to before. Was this the moment that would cost the president his re-election? The desperate move, Trump's last attempt to regain control. Trump was losing, but he had one last trick up his sleeve. His advisors were divided. Some insisted that the tariffs had to be lifted immediately to prevent further economic collapse, while others urged him to hold his ground, arguing that showing weakness now would be the worst possible move. The president, unwilling to admit defeat, chose a different path. In a carefully orchestrated press conference, the White House declared that the crisis was under control and that the administration was moving toward a historic trade victory. It was a bold claim and one that was met with immediate skepticism. Reporters pressed for specifics, but there were none to give. The only thing the administration could offer was the announcement of emergency trade negotiations with Canada, talks that were meant to project strength but instead signaled desperation. The markets reacted instantly. Business leaders saw the announcement for what it was, a last-ditch attempt to stop the bleeding. But behind the scenes, there was a far greater problem. Canada was no longer playing by Washington's rules. The days of quiet negotiations and compromise were over. Canadian officials made their position clear. There would be no discussions unless the tariffs were fully removed. There would be no half measures, no concessions, and no return to the way things were before. For the first time, the administration found itself backed into a corner. There was no more leverage. The very tariffs that had been meant to assert American dominance had now become a liability. Business leaders, members of Congress, and even longtime allies within the government were losing patience. Trump's ability to control the narrative was slipping, and every attempt to spin the crisis only made the situation worse. And yet, even with no good options left, he refused to back down. Instead, he doubled down on the claim that this was all part of a grand strategy. He insisted that Canada would soon be the one begging for negotiations. But deep inside the White House, reality had set in. The trade war had turned into a full-blown economic disaster, and there was no easy way out. The breaking point, Trump's legacy in ruins. This was no longer just a trade war. It was a defining moment for America's future. The administration had spent years crafting an image of strength, control, and economic superiority. But now, with the country teetering on the edge of a financial catastrophe, the cracks in that image were undeniable. The world was watching as Washington struggled to regain control. For decades, American economic power had gone unchallenged. Trade negotiations had always leaned in favor of the United States, with other nations forced to play by its terms. But this time was different. Canada had not only survived the economic attack, it had emerged stronger. And the consequences of that shift would be felt for years to come. The damage was deeper than anyone had anticipated. Large corporations, once confident in their foothold in the North American market, were now scrambling to adjust. Some had already begun shifting production overseas to avoid the uncertainty. Others were cutting their losses, scaling back operations, and pulling investments from industries that had become too unstable to sustain. The illusion of American economic invincibility had been shattered. The opposition wasted no time in seizing the moment. They called it the Great American Trade Blunder, a reckless gamble that had cost the nation billions. destabilized its industries, and jeopardized its position on the world stage. For the first time, Trump's second term was no longer a certainty. Polling data showed a sharp decline in public confidence. The very voters who had once championed his policies were now questioning whether the country could afford 4 more years of this strategy. Washington had underestimated Canada. It had assumed that economic pressure alone would be enough to force its northern neighbor into submission. But instead of breaking, Canada had fought back, outmaneuvered Washington, and left the United States facing an economic crisis it had created for itself. And the final twist? This trade war might have just reshaped global power forever. Is this the beginning of the end for U.S. global power? For years, economists and political analysts had warned that American dominance was not as secure as it seemed. The United States had built its influence through trade, diplomacy, and military strength, but the foundations of that power were beginning to show signs of erosion. The trade war with Canada had been intended as a show of force, a message to the world that Washington still dictated the rules of global commerce. But instead of reinforcing control, it had exposed a vulnerability no one could ignore. The ripple effects of the economic fallout stretched far beyond North America. As the United States struggled to contain the damage, other nations were taking note. European leaders, who had long relied on Washington's stability, were beginning to question whether they should diversify their alliances. Asian economies, once hesitant to challenge American policies, were growing bolder. Nations that had previously feared retaliation for resisting U.S. trade demands were now seeing a path forward. For Canada, the victory was not just financial, it was strategic. It had proven that standing up to a global superpower was not only possible, but could lead to tangible gains. Other countries facing similar economic pressure now had a model to follow. The balance of power was shifting, and the long-held assumption that the United States would always have the upper hand was beginning to fade. The American response to the crisis would determine what happened next. Would Washington attempt to reassert dominance through even more aggressive policies? Or would it be forced to accept that the world was changing? Could the administration afford to continue alienating allies? Or would it recognize the need to rebuild trust? What do you think? Comment down below, and thanks for staying till the end.